Welcome back. Our first pass video today is on CBS Knowledge Standard 1, which is Understanding the Philosophy of Functional Contextualism. So I'm staying pretty close to the heart of the sources, so there's a lot of slides with text, but I want to direct folks to those key sources if you want to look them up later. So if we go to the handbook, we see that the heart and soul of CBS, contextual behavioral science, is functional contextualism. So this thing is important, and CBS is intensely interested in the pragmatic truth linked to its stated goals and nothing else. That's a sly reference to the nothing else in Skinner's 1945 operationalism paper. So our goal today is to try to quickly unpack some of the key ideas that make up functional contextualism. So just narratively, if you've just heard the part where we talked about the 3 different waves of behavior therapy, this is the part where we are sort of in the 70s and then early 80s. So we're in the second wave of behavior therapy. The ABA folks not working so much with verbal behavior. They're kind of going off on their own. And in the second wave, we have a lot of interest in new cognitive approaches like Beck and Ellis and Bandura. But we also have a lot of folks that are coming from the behavioral wing of psychology. So the folks that were pretty closely following what Skinner was doing and have interest in bringing those approaches in to the cognitive approaches. And so actually, we have the example here of cognitive therapy coming out from Tim Beck. So early on, Steve Hayes was interested in this, kind of figuring out what was going on still from that behavior analytic perspective. And one of the things that Beck talks about is if we're going to do some cognitive changing, if we're going to recognize our thoughts and find more helpful ones, we have to notice them, which is to say we have to have some distance from them. So some of the early ACT work was actually about that whole process of like, how do we find distance from our thoughts? And it had the very alluring name of comprehensive distancing. So this idea that we could make some separation from our thoughts. One of the early interventions was called dysfunctional control by client verbal behavior, the context of reason giving, where Hayes and Zettel showed that if you change the context and you try to decrease the impact of people giving reasons, causal reasons for their behavior, you could see improvements without necessarily changing any of the content of the thoughts that they had. So this early idea of kind of changing the context in which verbal behavior occurs was important even back in the early work and in comprehensive distancing days. And in 1984, Steve Hayes publishes an article called Making Sense of Spirituality. That's not that surprising a title in psychology, but I think it is surprising where it was published, because it was published in behaviorism in a behavior analytic journal. So the kinds of places where we're talking about kind of rats and schedules of reinforcement, Steve Hayes is talking about how do we make sense of spirituality from a behavior analyst perspective. And it's some of the earliest approaches to what we now call self as context in ACT. Then around 1985, Steve Hayes gets excited about the phenomena of stimulus equivalence, which had been discovered in the 70s. And he has this idea that we could consider that operant behavior, and that becomes relational frame theory. As he does that, he's about to make a slight tweak on or break from Skinner, because to do this, this kind of prohibition on behavior relations, which we talked about was banned because it was thought to be mentalistic or wasn't sort of analyzable in terms of like environmental control of that. That was the ban on behavior relations. In 86, Hayes and Brownstein write an article talking about how this can be accommodated within behavior analysis, and that allows RFT to go forward and make some new contributions to understanding verbal behavior beyond what Skinner saw, which is why we see later in 2001 when the first RFT book is published, you see the subtitle there is a post-Skinnerian account of human language and cognition. So it is using this new approach based on behavior relations to describe relational frame theory and its application. So in that kind of intermediate period between 1985 and 1996, and then into kind of early 2000s, when there is this break, there's a lot of work from Steve Hayes and colleagues on the philosophy of science. So he goes back to see what Skinner had done, and then decides which pieces he's going to keep and if any need to be tweaked to have this continuity with this new focus on behavior relations that we see in RFT and in the development of ACT. And those philosophy of science articles lead to the philosophy of science that is called functional contextualism. So what did Steve do? So radical behaviorism already had kind of a grounding in the philosophy of pragmatism. Skinner already cared about that and was really influenced by the scientist Ernst Mach. So radical behaviorism already kind of had a philosophical base, but I think Steve wanted to go back and really dig into that more and see if there were places where they might slightly be distinguished. So some of the early articles in the philosophy of science for functional contextualism went back and introduced the behavior analysts to this book from 1942 by Stephen Pepper called World Hypotheses. And this had been talked about in some other areas of psychology, but not really in the cognitive behavioral therapy tradition, as far as I know. So this is bringing back interest in this book into that wing. And Pepper was not a scientist. This wasn't a book about science. He was a philosopher, and the purpose of this book was to offer a system to basically catalog all the different sort of philosophies that human beings have created over the thousands of years that we've had, written texts, all different kinds of theories of the world. And Pepper wanted to create some organization of this into what he called world hypotheses, or what we more commonly call world views. And so the basic idea is that there were 6. 2 of them Pepper thought were inadequate. The inadequate ones were sort of pure skepticism, this idea that you could just never know anything forever and always. That's not a useful way to organize a system. And the other one was dogmatism. It's true because somebody says it is, and you do it because you do it, or you're in trouble. So skepticism and dogmatism are out. But then Pepper thought all the other specific systems that had been proposed could fit within 4 categories or worldviews. And these are called formism, mechanism, organicism, and contextualism. So we'll just kind of quickly walk through them. There's a supplementary reading. A guy out of the Netherlands has put together kind of a cartoon version of Pepper's book. So if you want a little bit more explanation, the cartoons are kind of useful. And then if you're ready, it's kind of a cool book to read, although a little bit dense. And the idea of the worldview really is like, this is a way to sort of view the world and work with the world, and really captures everything in it. So it's not just limited to kind of a small part of the experience, but really could be a systematic way of interacting with and interpreting the world. So formism, this is kind of based on that idea of Plato's forms. So just this idea of a root metaphor. So in all the worldviews, you're going to see a root metaphor which organizes the metaphor, kind of brings to life the worldview. And each one's going to have a truth criterion, which is to say that each worldview has a different way of deciding what sort of is truth within that. So each has a root metaphor and a truth criterion. In formism, it's the root metaphor is just similarity. Things are sort of, this is similar to that, right? This triangle is similar to that triangle, so we have the form of a triangle. And the truth criterion is correspondence, how well we can put things in categories. There's no real prediction in there. It's just, this is a triangle, that's a square. If we get it right, we get it right. So informally, we might say, we're asking the question, what category does this thing belong to? Or what category does this situation belong to, this event? One possible example of this in psychology would be like our DSM diagnostic categories, where we're asking, sort of based on these symptoms, is it depression? Is it bipolar? Which category does it go into? And we get it right when we get the category right, but we don't necessarily predict anything more at that point. Another commonly used root metaphor is mechanism, where the root metaphor is the machine. So the idea is that the universe really has sort of these separate parts, and they interact, but the parts have their own kind of unique qualities, and they link up with other parts, and they have sort of forces on each other, and they interact. And so our job as scientists or folks in this world is to understand sort of the different real parts of this machine, and understand how kind of input leads to output. And our truth criterion here is going to be predictive verification. So you can imagine this like a science experiment, where we do an experiment and we sort of make a hypothesis, right? Think about like Galileo talking about objects falling at the same rate when you drop them without resistance. You deduce that, then you make a hypothesis, and then somebody somewhere else in some other setting verifies that. So like when they went to the moon and they dropped like a bowling ball and a feather at the same time on the moon, and they saw that they fell at the same rate because there was no atmosphere to interfere with them. They sort of independently verified the prediction that Galileo had made. And that's what we really want to see in mechanistic approaches, is the thing that we learn here doesn't work over there if we understand if it's the same parts and the same forces. So informally, we're asking the question, basically, how does this work? How does this thing work? And some examples from psychology would be any of the kind of cognitive domains. So think about like cognitive processing, either in like kind of a therapy context, or like the cognitive input-output from basic research, right? Like where there's some kind of visual input, and then there's processing, and then there's output, or some kind of decision making, right? Are people rational? You give them some input, and then they process it, and then their output is either rational or irrational. So in that sense, we're using the kind of the mind or the brain as a machine, right? And the worldview of thinking about things in the world as individual parts that have forces acting on them, where we look at input and output, it makes a lot of sense. And mechanism is an incredibly powerful worldview for science in general, and also within psychology even. But it does have some limitations that we've talked about. Third worldview that Pepper talked about is organicism. So this is based on the root metaphor of organic development. So things like an acorn develops over time to become a mighty tree, and that's sort of the point of it. The point of an acorn is to grow and develop. So if we look at another example in organicism, let's say a caterpillar who becomes a butterfly. If that was the first time anybody had encountered that, that would probably be a bit confusing. This caterpillar that goes into a cocoon and maybe looks dead, and then suddenly emerges later in a totally different form as a butterfly that could fly. And so we can see that there's this root metaphor of organic development, these stages that the caterpillar goes through. And our truth criterion is coherence, understanding the different stages that it goes through, and those inherent contradictions that seem to be there, like, is it dead? Over time, as we come to appreciate the whole process, we see that those contradictions fade away as we appreciate the whole process. So informally, our truth criterion there is asking kind of how well does what I'm seeing fit with the overall process, or what stage is this part of? I kind of understand what is unfolding here. In psychology, we see examples of this in developmental psychology, where we see the different stages that people might go through over the course of the lifespan. And finally, this brings us to contextualism. So, the functional contextualism that we are talking about comes from Pepper, who used this as an alternative to the philosophical term pragmatism. But essentially, it is a variant of the philosophical school of pragmatism. And our root metaphor here is the ongoing act in context. So the historical and situational act, as it is kind of ongoing, that is what our metaphor is going to be focused on. And our truth criterion is successful working, accomplishing some goal. Obviously, what that goal is may differ by situation and by the person who holds the goal. But essentially, in contextualism, what we're saying is we've stated some goal and we are measuring whether or not we have accomplished it. So informally, our truth criterion is asking, is this idea, is this analysis, is what I'm doing useful for effectively achieving the chosen goal that I have? And we see this examples of this in psychology, initially in Skinner's operant analysis of behavior, where we have this focus on understanding, can we influence a particular behavior of interest? Can we increase or decrease it? And is our way of talking about it using the ABC contingency, is that a useful way to effectively predict and control behavior of interest? More recently, when we get to ACT, what we see is the term workability, where we are asking a particular behavior, saying going to a wedding and drinking a lot with your friends. It- is that a good behavior or a bad behavior? Like, we have to appreciate that as the whole act in context, and we have to ask, what is it that the person is trying to achieve? And so, and for some folks that might be workable behavior, and for others not so much. So we use this idea of really specifying what it is that we're going after, and then really measuring, looking at, being interested in all those things that are useful for effectively achieving or failing to achieve that goal. And that, very briefly, is what the game is in pragmatism, or as we would call it here, contextualism. And one theme that I think is hard to see early on, but is important to understand, a unifying theme that is called selection by consequences. So this idea initially comes up in evolution. So the fact that species evolve was a known fact for a long time. What Darwin did was provide a theory, the theory of natural selection, where he argued that what we're seeing is genes are being selected and retained based on their consequences. In other words, genes build phenotypes, they build organisms that exist in context. And then if they thrive in those contexts such that they can propagate their genes onto further generations, then we see the genes are selected. So the genes build organisms that are uh, in different contexts, some more successful than others, and the context may change. Like with the Industrial Revolution, there was an impact on different rates of butterflies surviving based on the kind of patterns that they had. So we see this. So we see this idea that that genes are selected based on their consequences in evolution, but then selection by consequences doesn't just happen at the genetic level; it can also happen within the lifetime of a living organism. And we see that with Skinner's identification of operant behavior, where the behavior that organisms uh, the impact that that has on the environment then impacts the likelihood of that behavior continuing or not continuing in the future. So the frequency of the behavior in the future is shaped by the consequences and selected by the consequences. Uh, this is extended metaphorically into the realm of ideas when we get to pragmatism and contextualism, where the early pragmatists were really clear that what they were looking at is this idea that the ideas or the analyses are selected by their consequences. So, as William James says, the truth in our ideas means their power to work. So they have to be sort of usefully applied to achieve some consequence, and then those ideas or those analyses stick around. That's what we mean by pragmatic truth. And this even extends to symbolic areas and cultural practices that have a legacy over time, including cultural practices that we call doing science. So we don't have to do science this way, but one way we can do it is to try to select and retain those scientific practices based on their consequences. So practices that tend to be more useful and achieve the scientific um, goals can be could be selected, and we could have cultural practices based on a history of selection by consequences. But of course, this begs the question of what are the specific goals of science? So coming to that soon, but quickly, I wanted to say just a few words about what it means to work with different worldviews. So there are these different ones, and as you can see, each worldview is determined by its root metaphor, and each worldview is autonomous. They are separate from each other. And they are complete in the sense that they're imperfect, but they are trying to explain the universe completely. And so we have to be careful with eclecticism because it can be confusing. Strategically, we can adopt in a local way some of the things from another worldview. So, as a contextualist, you can borrow mechanistic talk, mechanistic practices, adopt some of the strategies of mechanism, but you'd want to be clear that at a bigger level, you're still working from a contextualistic point of view, or vice versa. A mechanist could borrow things from the contextualists. But you sort of have to pick your worldview and stick with it. You can't quite force them to come together. And we have to be careful too, just not to lose contact with the root metaphor. It's easy to get lost in kind of semantic abstraction. And so really thinking about at the deep level, at the level of practice, how is it that you are seeing the world? And what root metaphor are you using? That's going to tell you kind of which worldview you are working from. Some of the other implications of having these different worldviews. Basically, it's not going to be okay to disparage one worldview in terms of another. So, if you choose contextualism, if you love it, that's fine. But you can't, from that perspective, try to like score points on mechanism, right? Mechanism gets to sort of thrive by its own, you know, uh, its own sort of chosen worldview. So within mechanism, you can critique it, but we're not here to sort of like pick worldviews and say which one is best. And similarly, even if we can find flaws or cons in particular worldviews, pointing that out doesn't do anything to like strengthen ours or make ours better. Each worldview has to kind of survive on the strength of its own approaches and data and methodology. So um, that said, we also get to um, sort of see things through our chosen worldview. So someone could come from a place of doubt or from another worldview, and they could sort of go like, here's this thing and it's obviously true, or how do you deal with this? And if they're asking us to kind of deal with it on their own worldview terms, we get to respectfully kind of recast that into our own worldview, and we might have useful things to still say. So we aren't sort of we don't have the task of like convincing other people to make sense of those things through our own worldview. But we should try to be, of course, consistent with those rules that we've kind of given ourselves, with the worldview that we have chosen. And Steve Hayes argues that really for all of us, but particularly for contextualists, where we have goals that might be varied by community or by focus area or by different individuals, since the goals aren't sort of like given to us by the universe, we have to choose them. And so he really argues that we should own our own pre-analytic goals. So those are the goals that we choose before we start getting into the business of sort of evaluating how are we doing and are we achieving it. We have to just sort of state, this is what I'm after, and then we can start using the pragmatic kind of approach to see if we're kind of getting closer to that stated goal or not. So Steve has some recommendations about what make for good pre-analytic goals. I'm really calling for them to be kind of explicitly and publicly stated, not ones that are vague or that are never able to be assessed. And then kind of having a mix of short, medium, and long-term goals, so that you aren't always kind of always changing your goals just on, oh, this didn't work, let me try something else, right? You can have a kind of a too short window for kind of pragmatic workability. So you want medium and long-term goals of like, what am I trying to do over the course of months or years, and then still some space to kind of adjust your techniques or your strategies as you learn things, but really to kind of hold yourself accountable to some kind of long-term goal, and to be clear about if you're changing or adapting those goals over time. All right, so we've introduced contextualism, and so now we're about ready to jump to functional contextualism. I will say, just briefly, one of the papers on the philosophy of science talked about how there are different forms of scientific contextualism. So there was a book and with several papers in '93 that talked about this. And one of the other variants of contextualism that Hayes argued for was called descriptive contextualism. So these are contextualists, so they are appreciating the act context, but what their goals are is maybe more of like just a overall kind of appreciation, understanding of events without necessarily any claims towards like being able to influence those events. And gave the example of things like the phenomenology, hermeneutics, dramaturgy, things like that, where you have this sort of appreciation of it without necessarily so much like intervention. That was somewhat controversial, and so there's been some back and forth in the literature about whether the descriptive contextualism is kind of a meaningful label. But just want you to know that history is there, and that the type of contextualism that really is the focus for contextual behavioral science is called functional contextualism. And so what is the specific goal that we can look at to see if we've achieved kind of that pragmatic purpose? So the goal in functional contextualism is to predict and influence with precision, scope, and depth whole organisms interacting in and with a context considered historically and situationally. And so we'll unpack a couple of those terms in a second. But I really want to bring your attention to this predict and influence. And you'll see it's got the hyphens to kind of connect them together. So this is a really kind of key takeaway about what we're doing in functional contextualism is, so unlike mechanism where like prediction's really important, and in a way prediction is sort of the name of the game, right? Like predicting like based on what happened in Galileo's lab 300 years ago, right? Like we can predict what might happen on the moon 300 years later. Like their like prediction is really meaningful and is sort of successful, right? Um, Even if there isn't necessarily influence, right? Like the items just fall, the same speed. We didn't influence them, but we did a heck of a good job predicting them. So from a mechanistic perspective, we're crushing it. But from a functional contextualistic perspective, not necessarily. So what we're really interested is demonstrating that we have the ability to influence events of interest. We have to see some evidence of our influence, and without that, prediction essentially is worthless. So from this perspective, right, like I can predict with confidence and be right that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but I have no influence over that. I can't make it come up faster. I can't make it come up slower. I can't stop it from coming up. I have no influence over that event. So I'm not going to have prediction and influence. And so that thing means that I'm not going to take that on as a goal to sort of like influence the sun. You can see in here in the definition of functional contextualism, I'm okay because we're talking about, we're limiting our focus to whole organisms, right? So we're already kind of limiting this to like biological organisms like, human beings and animals, like folks where I can potentially have some influence. But even there, when it comes to animals and humans and organisms, if I don't have a way to influence some event of interest, then it doesn't really matter if I can predict things about it, because from that contextualistic perspective, I haven't achieved my goal until I can demonstrate this kind of combined prediction and influence. So that's a really key difference between psychological approaches based in contextualism and those based in other um, worldviews like mechanism, where prediction might go a long way. So then there are a couple of terms in there. So what do we mean by precision? So by precision, what we mean is that there only a few analytic concepts should be applicable in any given setting, right? So if I notice that for like Jack sings, uh, when his mom pays attention to him, and Jill sings if you give her cookies after she sings. Like I could start to have a lot of different concepts. Like I could have the sort of like Jack gets, attention from his mom. That's one concept, and Jill gets, uh, uh, excited by cookies, and that's another concept. And you could see how like you could have millions and millions of kind of these very specific situational concepts, but they wouldn't be very precise. And so you get a concept like reinforcement, very precise, that talks about like an increase in a particular behavior in particular settings, right? That's what we mean by reinforcement, and it's how we come to identify something as a reinforcer. So that concept of reinforcement is highly precise, and we don't need a lot of other concepts to play along with it to explain lots of behavior. So we want in our science and in functional contextualism, we want to limit a number our concepts to be ones that are really kind of useful and precise. At the same time, we have this other term of scope. So we want things that are going to apply to a wide range of phenomena. So again, reinforcement is a good example here. So reinforcement doesn't just apply to Jack. There could be some things that are specific to Jack that are only true for him, and it's important to try to find those out and be open to them. But what we're really looking for is we're hoping to find principles and concepts that have a high degree of scope, so that they apply not just to Jack but to Jill and to other people and lots of other folks, besides just the focus on singing. So we want them to have a high degree of scope and precision. And we also care about depth. So depth means that these concepts are going to butt up against other kinds of science going on, against biology and chemistry and computer science, all that stuff. And when they come together, we want them to cohere. So we don't want things that work for us in our science and then immediately are kind of in conflict with known principles from biology and chemistry and physics, things like that. So we want depth, and so together we want all of these things. We want to be able to have prediction and influence with precision, scope, and depth. So then, from a functional contextual perspective, what is science about? So science is a social enterprise that seeks the development of increasingly organized statements. So these are statements, understandings of the relations among events that allow analytic goals to be accomplished with precision, scope, and depth. And they've also got to be based on verifiable experience. So we care about that sort of public, observable thing, not just hypothetical things. So verifiable experience, things that have a precision, scope, and depth. But notice they they are statements that allow us to achieve our analytic goals. So they could be beautiful, they could be complex, they could be lots of things. But if they don't actually increasingly allow us to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves, they're not really any better, or they're not really part of science. So science is about sort of sorting that out and figuring out what is the best ways to talk about the relations between events that give us the things that we want from science in both a basic and kind of applied context. So putting it all together, what is it that we mean when we talk about CBS, contextual behavioral science? Lots of terminology here. Principle focus, so we want it to be organized around principles. Communitarian, meaning we want it to be shared. Reticulated scientific and practical development, basically meaning we want practitioners and scientists to be talking to each other, to be informed by each other. It's going to be grounded in the contextual philosophical assumptions, right? So functional contextualism, and then nested within an understanding of evolutionary science, which we'll talk a little bit more soon, but this multidimensional, multi-level evolution science. We want basic and applied scientific concepts and methods. Why? We want them to be useful in predicting and influencing contextually embedded actions of organisms. That includes individual people and groups. And we want, again, that precision, scope, and depth. And we want to apply that into the process itself. So within the science and the practice itself, so that it's kind of pragmatism and contextualism all the way down. And how do we know when we're done? When we have a science that is more adequate to the challenges of the human condition, right? So this is coming from the inaugural article in the journal Contextual Behavioral Science in 2012, basically saying we want this for the real challenges that real people have, and wherever those are, whether they are kind of highly verbal constructs, or in basic kind of behavioral principles, like whatever the principles are, the name of the game is to help meet the challenge of being human, as we are in individuals and in groups and in the real lives that we face. And the things that help us do that better, that is CBS, potentially going to stick around longer. And things that are kind of unhelpful for that, or don't move us closer to that goal, we just sort of sort them out, and they may be true in a sense, but they're not part of the science. And so that is what CBS is about. So just to kind of be more explicit, so a lot of this was informed by the pragmatism that was already there in Skinner's radical behaviorism. So what did we get that's new? So in radical behaviorism, there was this similar kind of singular focus on um, prediction and control, and you had successful prediction when you could show that you had control. That's been replaced by this term, prediction and influence. Again, single kind of unified thing. You show you have prediction when you by demonstrating influence. A couple of reasons for the change. Sometimes control means, it sounds like it's kind of limited, like just kind of close it down. But we're open to the idea of behavioral variability. We're not trying to limit or necessarily have consistent behavior. Variability might be really important, and we want to be able to show prediction and influence towards variability. Um, Also, that can be a little bit of like a weird term. Like, it sounds weird to kind of control behavior. So we don't want to emphasize like this idea that we're trying to control behavior. We're just talking about, like, we want to be practically useful, and so to be useful, we have to influence behavior. So that's why we focus on that influence rather than control. And also, the final reason is, we there are times when we really can find influence, but we know that behavior is under the control of a lot of different um, stimuli, and some of those are not totally under our influence, and some of these things are kind of more probabilistic. They don't reliably happen, like kind of in a one-to-one way. So the influence, helps us focus on the fact that we might have kind of partial influence. We might sort of get probabilistic changes in behavior. And those are important too, even if we don't get all the way to kind of full control of behavior. You also saw that functional contextualism is more explicit about stating and owning its pre-analytic goals, and then just acknowledging that like goals might differ between different individuals and different groups, and there isn't necessarily the aim to kind of have everybody share the same goals. Just to be clear about what those are, so we can see where there's areas of similarity and difference across groups, and then to try to keep us focused as a group on what our goals are, and be focused on that process of are we actually moving closer to achieving them in the way that we said. And then another difference between radical behaviorism and functional contextualism is functional contextualism is going to allow this new focus on behavior relations that allows RFT to come in and move to that kind of post-Skinnerian view of language and cognition. So behavior relations are in as long as they are still serving the goal of prediction and influence. And then just before we go on the topic of functional contextualism, I just wanted to share something personal about why it is that I have chosen and still choose to have this be kind of a worldview that I hold pretty dearly. Because to be honest, it can be hard to learn this stuff. If you know, like there are lots of different ways to sort of be with people and to do therapeutic work, and some of them are a little easier, honestly, I would say, to kind of learn and understand and try to master than this approach. So there's been times when I'm like, why am I doing this? And if, you know, I feel like maybe it's time to go. Um, but so far I've stayed, and I think there's two main reasons. The first one is just this idea of getting away from kind of simple prediction to the kind of combined focus on prediction and influence, really um, only trying to find those things where you have some ability to demonstrate influence, I think has just been so um, clarifying and reinforcing for me. So I put up here a great paper if you haven't seen it. It's from the 70s, and it's the very sarcastic great psychologist Paul Meehl about why he doesn't attend case conferences, and it's so relevant today. But anyway, like one of the things you might have experienced if you've been in kind of a generic kind of case conference, you know, talking about clients, is there's this kind of thing where you can get sort of vague on vague, where it's like, well, there's this thing that's going on, and like maybe this is what's going on, and maybe this concept sort of explains it, and maybe this sort of concept from that thing over there would sort of help. And then, you know, you think about this concept and that theory, and what about this technique? And it's sort of like, uh, I don't know. I don't know what to do with that. I don't find those very helpful. But if anybody's sort of been in supervision with me, um, you know, or case staffings, you might notice that a lot of times I have an answer, and I don't mean like I know like what to do, or I'm confident that I know exactly what's going on. But what's happening is I'm really thinking about like if I care about prediction and influence, so influencing some like therapist behavior, like what a therapist can do in session, and similarly interested in having some prediction and influence in the client's life in some useful way. And I hold myself to that standard of like, whatever I say needs to, you know, try to get at prediction with influence that can be demonstrated. And, you know, the only way I know that it sort of works is actually see the influence. It means that I'm not really interested in concepts that are sort of give prediction, like, oh, it could mean this, or this concept sort of offers this thing. And I'm like, but what is the clear influence? And if I can't see it, then I'm trying to find something where I do see a potential sort of influence, and then feed that back as here's a thing that we could do that we could really see, and try to sort through all the different kind of things that might happen in a case consultation to think about like where are those places where I think I really could see prediction and influence. And it doesn't necessarily mean every case is like an ACT case. You can do things with other models, but if you really care about prediction and influence and ask like, is the thing I'm saying like, could it meet this criterion for prediction and influence? If it can't meet it, I sort of don't say it, and I sort of don't put much weight on it when I hear it, because I'm like, at the end of the day, we have a stated goal, right? Which is to help clients move towards more, kind of vital living, right? That's what we take on. And so I'm really interested in the things that actually give us influence, to move usefully towards that, and are not interested in much else. So um, that piece of functional contextualism, I think, um, I'm keeping pretty strongly. And the other thing that I guess I would say is, in some ways, I think our science is still young. I think we're still not, you know, that powerful, sort of a science. And there are other approaches. There are other theoretical approaches and methodologies that have their charm. But I noticed this problem, right? Okay, so like let's say you like attachment. So you're gonna view somebody, you're gonna view what's happening through the lens of attachment. So you make this prediction for what's going to happen. Okay, but let me give you a contrasting example of what might happen in medicine. So in medicine, like if you're a doctor and you do a clinical assessment and you talk to a client and you get some blood work and you do a good evaluation, you might go like they have diabetes, right? And you believe they have diabetes, from the A1C and other kind of clinical indicators, and you believe that even if the client says, I don't even believe in diabetes. I don't have diabetes. Like no, it can't be that, right? Like you would sort of go like, no, I think it's diabetes, and you could do your treatment based on that. You could do, like, you could prescribe metformin, something like that, and your patient might say like, I don't believe in any of this. I don't have diabetes, but you're a nice guy, so I'll take this pill for whatever reason, right? They take the pill, the A1C comes down, all the symptoms show improved diabetes. You're managing diabetes, right? Like, and it doesn't really matter what your client is saying. Like right? Like you can sort of see diabetes conceptually, even though the behavior of the patient is sort of like, I don't believe in it. Um, None of this matters. But when it comes to psychotherapy, when you say, like, if you have attachment as your lens and you suspect that something's going to happen, I've never seen a case where somebody's like, yeah, like it was an attachment thing. I did it. It definitely worked, even though all the sort of overt behaviors are kind of inconsistent with that. Like the client's doing things that are like showing, kind of this old attachment pattern, and the client, you know, isn't showing me any change. But like really, at a deep level, I can see change. Like, I think part of the problem is right now, until we have a stronger, science of psychology, whatever concept you have, especially working clinically, you're going to verify that by what happens behaviorally, right? Like if it moves in the way that it's supposed to, then you're like, yep, it worked. I did attachment explains it. Fine. But if it doesn't work, you're going to point to the behavior as proof that it didn't work. And then you're going to be asking like, well, what can I do? Like I tried this thing and it didn't quite work the way I wanted to, because here's what happens between me and my client. And so what do I do next? And you're going to be really quite focused on the question of what do I do in this clinical interaction, to have some outcome, which essentially, right, is right at the core of the like functional contextual question of like, right, I'm trying to have prediction and influence. I'm trying to make something happen, and I really care about that. And so for me, I think holding on to that frame, even if you aren't sort of like a behaviorist through and through, even if you don't think behaviorism has all sort of the answers, right now, I don't see much way of working with these other kind of conceptual systems, um, unless you're really willing to kind of look at the kind of unfolding of behavior. And the folks that have a lot to say about kind of how to do that, and what's useful to focus on are coming out of this behavior analytic and functional contextualistic wing. So I think for me right now, until I can see kind of an alternative way where I could sort of see what's happening and really believe that I could understand what's happening through another lens that wasn't dependent on kind of verifying what happens in a kind of behavior way, um, I think functional contextualism is kind of the only way in to seeing other parts of the system. And so those kind of two reasons, like, lets me really focus on prediction and influence, and it lets me see kind of when other things are working or not working, and then to think about what do I need to do about that, to make those work even kind of on their own terms, means that functional contextualism, kind of has um, a deep place in my heart.